Blood of the Condor, originally titled Yahuamalco in Quechua, was directed by Bolivian filmmaker Jorge Sanjines and released in 1969. The film follows an indigenous Bolivian community as they receive medical care from the American Peace Corps, who have recently set up a clinic in their local village. Unbeknownst to them, the Peace Corps have been secretly sterilizing the local woman. Ignacio, the group leader, grows suspicious of their activities and rounds up the locals to attack the foreigners. However, he is shot by the corrupt Bolivian authorities. As a result, his wife Paulina takes him to hospital in La Paz, where Ignacio's brother, Sisto, is working, having left the indigenous community for life in the city. Despite Sisto's desperate efforts to acquire money for a blood transfusion for his brother, he is ultimately unsuccessful, and the film ends as he returns to his community, with the closing shot echoing a call for arms. The 1960s marked a turbulent period for Bolivia, as well as many other nations in Latin America at the time, as they found themselves at the crossroads of political, social, and economic change, deeply influenced by the currents of the Cold War. Following the Cuban Revolution in 1959, which served as a symbolic and tangible example of successful resistance to US influence, the United States sought to maintain control in the region through neocolonialism. They exerted these efforts through cultural imperialism, foreign intervention, and the exploitation of indigenous communities. In particular was the Alliance for Progress, an organization established by Kennedy in 1961, which was presented as a pledge to Latin American nations. The organization aimed to improve income, democracy, education, and infrastructure, instigating the modernization theory and the transition towards industrial capitalism and modernity. The indigenous communities in Latin America were perceived as an obstacle for the Alliance for Progress, as they were thought to operate in a way that clashed with modernization. At the end of the 60s and early 70s, there was a rise in revolutionary Latin American cinema which sought to represent the left-wing working class. Sanjines was one of the most prominent filmmakers during this time, as he believed that cinema would serve as a combat weapon for these groups of people, and as a means through which people could learn about the role of state-backed institutions and their interference in Bolivian society. Most significantly, he is recognized for his work that addresses the impact of neocolonialism in indigenous culture. The Blood of the Condor was filmed in the Quechuan language and starred people from the village where it was shot. Sanjines himself said that the sterilization of women in Latin American indigenous communities was a real phenomenon promoted by the US government in the 1960s, and his film was seminal in addressing this otherwise covert operation. In this video, we will examine how The Blood of the Condor largely exemplifies the prevailing view amongst Latin Americans that the region was experiencing US neocolonialism due to the control they exerted through the lens of the modernization theory. We will focus on their periodical intervention, the presence of the Peace Corps and their role in sterilizing women as a way to use healthcare as a tool of control, and the film's extensive use of symbolism and cinematography to portray resistance against neocolonialist structures. However, it can be argued that the film was not entirely representative of the working class and indigenous communities, due to its emphasis on bourgeoisie cinema and complex temporal structure. We will investigate to what extent The Blood of the Condor demonstrates the perception of US neocolonialism amongst left-wing groups in Latin America, and to what extent the film was successful as a tool for raising awareness about US neocolonialist interference among the working classes.
During the Cold War, the United States pursued a strategy of exerting influence and control over Bolivia, mirroring its approach in every Latin American country, driven by the goal of containing the spread of communism. This became especially crucial in the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution. The US sought dominance in Bolivia not only for ideological reasons, but also for economic and strategic considerations. The modernization theory envisioned progress marked by industrialization, urbanization, technological innovation, and the assimilation of Western-style institutions and values. The US implemented initiatives like the Alliance for Progress, to which President Kennedy pledged to donate $20 billion, and was designed to promote economic development and social reform in Latin American countries. Bolivia emerged as the second largest recipient of US aid globally, and therefore became very susceptible to neocolonial influence. The effects of modernization, and by extension neocolonialism, are seen widely within The Blood of the Condor. On her first visit to the city, Paulina looks up in shock at the towering high-rise buildings. She's surrounded by a busy urban environment, an experience very unfamiliar to her. However, the scene we want to focus on is that of Ignacio's brother, Sixto, who works on the production line of a factory. which is characterized by a plethora of imposing and noisy machinery, and workers who do the same repetitive and mundane task like cogs in a machine. Not only does the film show the effects of US neocolonialism, it criticizes the capitalist lifestyle. What should be a better way of life is instead isolating and perpetually unfulfilling. This idea is further illustrated through the living conditions of Sixto, who possesses nothing more than a bed. Notably, in the film, we even see him eyeing up a bourgeois lady's purse at the market when he is desperate for money to buy blood for his brother, highlighting the clear difference between the praised capitalist dreams imposed by US neocolonialist influence and the tough reality of Sixto's life. The US further applied the modernization theory and framed economic growth within a narrative that linked military funding from affluent nations to ensure a country's adherence to development. This meant that a significant portion of US aid allocated for Bolivia was directed towards bolstering the police and army. To counter attacks in the state and the spread of communism, the US armed and trained the police and military forces. Notably, Che Guevara, a leader of the Cuban Revolution, was killed in Bolivia by the army with the support of the CIA, showing a direct link between the Bolivian state forces and the US government. The Blood of the Condor illustrates this key idea that the police were associated with the USA. For example, the local police officer closely corresponds with the Peace Corps, which is an agency still running today that sends volunteers from the US to other countries such as Bolivia in order to provide assistance in international development. Furthermore, when Ignacio finds out that the Peace Corps has been sterilizing their women, he decides to take direct action against them. Therefore, he then becomes a threat to the interests of the US and is shot by the police, highlighting their affiliation to North American interests. Ignacio's shooting can also be linked to a dislike of indigenous people due to their clashing with the modernization theory, since these communities rejected capitalist ideologies. The prevailing notion was that these indigenous communities were backward and needed intervention to bring around progress. The modernization theory discouraged the use of indigenous languages, promoted Western medicine, implemented more efficient agricultural practices, and introduced family planning measures, often in a forceful way that marginalized and disrupted traditional indigenous lifestyles. The reasoning behind these measures was rooted in the belief that these small villages posed an obstacle to societal progress and development, completely disregarding the fact that Bolivia has one of the highest indigenous populations. However, the Blood of the Condor severely criticizes this idea and promotes native groups. For example, Ignacio and his community reject the modern clothes given by the Peace Corps. The film's pivotal moment unfolds when Sixto, who originally lived in the city and tried to rid himself of his heritage by adopting modern clothing, only speaking Spanish, and denying any affinity to the indigenous community, rejoins his family. In a compelling final scene, he reunites with his people, marching proudly in traditional clothing. This serves as a symbol of rejecting modernity and embracing the cultural roots he once sought to discard. Therefore, The Blood of the Condor unveils the impact of US influence on Bolivia, which was driven by the objective of containing communism. The film reflects the view of left-wing Latin Americans by critiquing the capitalist lifestyle and serves as an exploration of the interplay between neocolonialism, modernization, and indigenous resistance in Bolivia.
Manifestation of this conflict between neocolonialism and the indigenous people is personified by characters from the Progress Corps, representing members of President Kennedy's newly created Peace Corps in The Blood of the Condor. Their westernized attire and limited Spanish proficiency immediately disrupt the indigenous representation of the previous scenes, set amongst the Bolivian mountains with Quechua dialogue. Unbeknownst to the viewer, due to the non-chronological nature of the film, the Peace Corps' primary mission was not charitable foreign aid, but instead acting as a facade for the United States' true modernization scheme, which from regarding the indigenous communities meant population control. The Peace Corps, along with the support of the US-funded Bolivian military, sent university students to set up medical services throughout the country. Already symbols of imperialist development and modern civilization, as they offered aid to those they considered less fortunate, but actually used the maternity centres to secretly sterilize indigenous women, without their consent. The discovery of this atrocity leading to the violent interrogatory response of Ignacio and other indigenous revolutionaries. Despite the widespread outrage that followed the film's release at the depiction of these horrific acts, Neither the US nor Bolivia ever acknowledged these events. However, Sanquines wrote that in Bolivia, as an immediate result of the film's distribution, the North Americans suspended their mass distribution of contraceptives, recalled all the members of the organization who had been working in 3 sterilization centers, and received several staff members' resignations. However, the Peace Corps was not expelled until a few years later by the Bolivian government, with some arguing that this was purely a show of nationalism and the government should have gone further to repair the relationship with the US without adhering to its controlling imperialism. Sanquines hinted to this imperialist influence in the scene where Paulina refuses to sell her eggs to the Peace Corps activists, who with their capitalist principles could not comprehend her community-based mindset. Furthermore, their ignorance of the Quechua language only paints a more grotesque portrayal of the American presence in South America. The symbolism of the eggs only impresses the wrongness of their undisclosed mission in the health center, given its connotations of stolen fertility. Despite the fact the Americans steal her reproductive abilities, something culturally essential for indigenous and most women of the time, when Paulina was conscious of her decision, she refused to also give the material possessions they wished to strip from her. This is the first time a female character moves from passivity to modernity, and Paulina's decision is the only semblance of a revolutionary act from a female character. This is noteworthy due to the film's predominant focus on the male character Sixto's development. However, Paulina's agency remains a relevant contribution to the indigenous resistance to neo-colonialist oppression. Furthermore, the bourgeois perspective on the reproductive practices of rural indigenous communities was characterized by a perception of irresponsibility and perceived lack of control, often invoking the analogy of prolific rabbit breeding. This portrayal underscored the prevailing notion that intervention was required to manage what was perceived as unchecked demographic growth. Unlike Dr. Mayan's wife, who is seen greeting her 4 children, which is not criticized due to her wealth. Moreover, the film showcases an alignment between these Bolivian upper class and American neo-colonialist values, with notable representation, the doctor's wife conversing in English, the language of neo-colonial influence, with her young children in the domestic sphere. The dissonance starkly contrasts with the linguistic environment of the Quechua community depicted in the film, where even proficiency in Spanish is minimal. This linguistic juxtaposition serves as a visual manifestation of the socio-cultural disparity between the privileged upper class and the marginalized indigenous people, further highlighting the perpetuation of neo-colonialist values within the plot. The endorsement of surgical sterilization may not be the only or primary acts of US imperialism in Bolivia, but they underline the dehumanizing perspective that the US held towards indigenous people, exemplified by their research. This depersonalization reflects a systemic view that treated indigenous populations as subjects to be controlled, rather than as human beings entitled to basic rights. The Blood of the Condor serves as a powerful critique of this mindset, constituting a vehement protest against the maltreatment of indigenous communities. The subsequent quote emphasizes the broader socio-political struggle against internal colonialism and external neocolonialism, equating the preservation of Latin American masses in subjugated conditions to the treatment of Lats in a laboratory. The film, in its expressive quality, emerges as a poignant declaration that rejects the reduction of communities to experimental subjects. The assertion that the exposure of truth is the most revolutionary cultural action further underscores the film's transformative potential, making truth-telling the catalyst for a cultural and societal change. In essence, these quotes collectively highlight the film's role as a rallying cry against oppressive ideologies and practices, championing the importance of truth in dismantling powerful systemic injustice.
Sanquines follows a near-realist approach when filming The Blood of the Condor, which was eventually seen by more Bolivians than any film before, domestic or foreign, through the employment of non-professional actors, including many Quechuan villagers who hadn't seen a camera before. Whilst filming on location, Sanquines demonstrates Bolivian perspective authenticity in his documentary-style film, further contributed to through effective cinematographic techniques. Although Sanquines has argued that the audience do not see through their eyes and do not feel what they feel, he proclaims that using contrast cinema stirs the viewer to a visceral participation with the images, creating the impression of seeing events from within, due to its capacity for spatial and temporal manipulation. Taking this approach whilst filming allowed the audience to connect personally with the characters and their struggles. It allowed viewers to experience events objectively, fostering engagement and their understanding of reality, making the film's critiques of neocolonialism furthermore poignant. Sanquines' film largely eschews condescension, heroics, and soapboxing, and instead of overtly pushing a specific ideological agenda in the narrative or on the characters, he allows the story to unfold organically. Given that his film was to transform passive spectators into conscious agents of liberation, we can see how Sanguinés specifically chose this neo-realist approach to contribute to the foregrounding political and revolutionary agendas circulating the third cinema movement. The Blood of the Condor actually became one of the most iconic examples of third cinema, opposing first cinema's Hollywood's focus on entertainment, but also second cinema's aesthetically orientated European films, given that the film culminates on a revolutionary note, one that effectively transcended the screen, leading to a popular uprising that ejected the Peace Corps from Bolivia, making it one of the third cinema films that led to direct action. Evidently, the influence of the scene before we discover Ignacio's death, where Ignacio and his community retaliate by kidnapping the Americans, attest to the symbolic retribution through breaking away from passive resistance and signalling a shift towards revolutionism. The shaky camera work in combination with the flickering torchlight at the end of the film further contributes to this sense of immediacy in the neo-realist approach adopted. The tense mise-en-place of the intermittent torchlight on the American's desperate face as he vanishes into the abyss communicates the psychological toll of his predicament, whilst additionally symbolising the wavering power dynamics that have now been reversed. The cyclical nature of power dynamics is once again returned, however, when we hear, "My embassy will punish you." A crane shot then descends towards Ignacio on his deathbed, substantiating his words, as Ignacio is now the embodiment of the consequences of such revolutionary actions. The title itself skillfully employs symbolism and imagery to convey a nuanced exploration of the neo-colonialist atmosphere. One prominent symbol is the Andean condor, a powerful bird deeply rooted in the cultural and mythological fabric of the Andean region, traditionally symbolizing freedom and resistance. Suggesting a violation of this freedom, the title blatantly voices the exploitation and interference carried out by the Peace Corps, who directly assaulted the lifeblood of the community, eroding their autonomy. The condor, therefore, becomes a poignant, liberative visual metaphor for the impacts of neocolonialism on Quechuan communities. Furthermore, symbolism is demonstrated within the film to convey subtle irony. As stated earlier, regarding the confrontational egg scene, where the low-angle shot of the American against the high-angle shot of Paulina, portraying her vulnerability, reflects the contrasting power dynamics. The staunch refusal to sell eggs transcends the symbolic rejection of capitalist values, as eggs represent fertility, which is ironic as Paulina has been sterilized by the Americans, henceforth reinforcing the barbaric principles behind the Peace Corps interventions. Moreover, the symbolic potential of the impoverished is reinforced, as the burdens of the rich are now depending on the poverty of the poor. However, Paulina's trajectory also dramatizes the unique challenges faced by the indigenous women. Sanguinés explores this by depicting her meekness in the face of Ignacio's violence, attributing both spiritual and emotional weaknesses to her character. This portrayal serves as an exploration of how imperialist and domestic violence intersect, particularly targeting the bodies of indigenous women. The film strategically employs Paulina's character to highlight the convergence of imperialist and domestic violence, positioning the narrative within the broader context of resistance. By initiating the film with a scene depicting Paulina's vulnerability and concluding it with a revolutionary stance, Sanguinés encourages viewers to consider an indigenous nationalist vision as a fitting response to both forms of violence. In addition to the cyclical nature of life, symbolized through the eggs and Paulina's character, Sanguinés adopts a montage that mixes a circular structure with a parallel structure in this film. Parallel storytelling, through intertwining the personal stories of the characters with the broader political and social context, we receive a more emotionally resonant critique of the current Bolivian climate. The fragmented narrative, seen through the alternating sequences in which we discover the reasons why Ignacio has been shot, with sequences where we witness Sixto's struggles in saving his brother, lends itself toward a very experimental, avant-garde film for its time. While Sanguinés may have been aiming to emulate the Pachacuti temporality, the indigenous non-linear concept of time, he overshadowed the realist approach to his production. The second cinema-style narrative overlooked true authenticity with aesthetic techniques derived from modernist traditions, which ultimately led to confusion among the Bolivian people surrounding the film's raw political aims.
Overall, The Blood of the Condor certainly exemplifies the prevalent views of the working classes in Latin America that the region was experiencing US neocolonialism during the Cold War, through its depiction of the foreign intervention and control on Bolivian society, and through the means of the modernization theory in the guise of the Peace Corps. The film underscores the prevailing view that the United States, in its pursuit of strategic interests, perpetuated a neo-colonial agenda, politically intervening and undermining the sovereignty of Latin American nations. Although the film can be criticized for its lack of representation and authenticity in light of Sanginez's emphasis on third cinema, its influence on Bolivian society cannot be denied. Through its acknowledgement of the exploitative US interference in the country through a multifaceted focus on symbolism and cinematographic techniques, The Blood of the Condor contributed to the expulsion of the Peace Corps in Bolivia, and at the time was seen by more Bolivians than any other film before. The Blood of the Condor stands as a testament to the lasting impact of cinema as a medium for denouncing the structures of exploitation and power, and as a catalyst for change. As Sanginez wrote in his account of filming, the exposure of truth is the most revolutionary cultural action, which can certainly be attested in this film.